Some secrets are kept to protect ourselves. Others are kept to protect the people we love most. What happened when 95-year-old Thomas Whitfield stepped onto the Family Feud stage was the unraveling of a secret so profound, so carefully guarded for 7 decades, that when he finally revealed it, Steve Harvey stood frozen in disbelief for a full minute, unable to process what he was hearing. Thomas looked like any other elderly man, thin and frail with age-spotted hands that trembled slightly as he gripped his walker. His 3 children, all in their 60s, stood beside him beaming with pride that their father was alert enough at 95 to participate in a game show, thinking this would be a fun family memory, a light-hearted afternoon of laughter and bonding. None of them had any idea that within 20 minutes, everything they thought they knew about their father, about themselves, about their entire family history, would be revealed as a carefully constructed fiction, and the truth would be far more extraordinary than anything they could have imagined. If you've ever wondered what you would sacrifice to keep your children safe, if you've ever considered what parts of yourself you would erase to give your family a better life, you need to hear what this 95-year-old man had been hiding for 7 decades. Before we begin, if you believe some truths are so powerful they change everything, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel because we share stories about real people, real secrets, and real courage that will leave you speechless. Thomas Whitfield was not actually named Thomas Whitfield. He was born Tomasz Wisniewski in 1929 in a small village outside Warsaw, Poland. He grew up speaking Polish, attending a Catholic church every Sunday with his parents and 2 younger sisters, playing in the narrow cobblestone streets of a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where families had lived for generations. His father was a schoolteacher, his mother a seamstress. They were not wealthy, but they were happy, secure in their community, rooted in their traditions, building a life they thought would last forever. Then, in September 1939, when Tomasz was 10 years old, everything changed. The Nazis invaded Poland, and within weeks, his entire world collapsed. His father, being an educated man and a teacher, was considered dangerous by the occupying forces. He was taken away in November of 1939, supposedly to a labor camp, but the family never heard from him again. His mother tried to keep Tomasz and his sisters safe, but food became scarce, violence became routine, and the occupation grew more brutal with each passing month. By 1941, when Tomasz was 12, Warsaw was completely under Nazi control. His neighborhood, which had been working class and mixed, was being systematically cleared. Families were being rounded up and sent to ghettos or camps. His mother, desperate and terrified, made a decision that would save her son's life but cost her own. She had a friend, a Polish Catholic woman named Christina, who worked as a nurse, who was connected to the underground resistance network helping children escape. Christina offered to take Tomasz, to get him false papers identifying him as her nephew, to hide him in plain sight by giving him a new identity. His mother had to make an impossible choice: save her son by sending him away with a stranger, or keep him with her and risk them all dying together. She chose to save him. In March of 1942, when Tomasz was 13 years old, his mother kissed him goodbye, pressed a small gold cross necklace into his hand, the only thing of value she owned, and told him something he would never forget. "You are Tomasz Wisniewski, son of teachers, grandson of farmers, Polish and Catholic. Never forget who you are. But to survive, you must pretend to be someone else. Pretend so well that even you believe it. And when this is over, when you are safe, come back to us." Christina took Tomasz that night, and he never saw his mother or his sisters again. She gave him new papers identifying him as Tomasz Kowalski, her sister's son from the countryside, orphan, when his parents died in a farming accident. She taught him a new story about his life, new details about his fictional parents, new memories to replace his real ones. She made him practice until he could recite his false history without hesitation, until he responded naturally to his new name, until there was no trace of his real identity visible. For 3 years, from age 13 to 16, Tomasz lived with Christina, helping her in the clinic where she worked, learning to be invisible, to be unremarkable, to be the nephew from the countryside who everyone assumed had always been there. He watched Warsaw burn during the uprising in 1944. He saw unimaginable horrors, violence and death, and suffering that no child should ever witness. And through it all, he clung to his mother's final words: "Never forget who you are. Come back to us when this is over." But when the war finally ended in 1945, when the Germans were defeated and the Soviet army moved in, Tomasz went back to his old neighborhood to find his family, and there was nothing left. The building where they'd lived had been destroyed. The neighbors who survived told him his mother and sisters had been taken in 1943, sent to Treblinka, and no one who went to Treblinka came back. Tomasz was 16 years old, utterly alone in the world, and the only family he had was Christina, the woman who had saved his life by giving him a false identity. He tried to reclaim his real name, tried to be Tomasz Wisniewski again, but there were no records. Everyone who had known his family was dead or scattered. His father's school had been destroyed, his mother's church had been bombed. There was no proof that Tomasz Wisniewski had ever existed. But Tomasz Kowalski, the fictional nephew from the countryside, he had papers, he had a documented history, he had an identity that was recognized by the new authorities. So Tomasz made a decision. He would stay Tomasz Kowalski. He would keep the fiction that had saved his life, because the truth had become impossible to prove, and maybe too painful to carry. He lived in Warsaw for another 2 years, but the city was haunted for him. Every street corner held memories of his family. Every destroyed building was a reminder of what he'd lost. And as the Soviet occupation solidified, as Poland fell under communist control, Tomasz realized he needed to leave. He needed to go somewhere where he could start completely over, where no one knew him, where he could build a new life from nothing. In 1947, at age 18, he managed to get permission to immigrate to the United States through a displaced persons program. He arrived in New York in January 1948 with nothing but the clothes he was wearing, the false papers identifying him as Tomasz Kowalski, and his mother's gold cross hidden in his pocket, the only real thing he had left from his real life. He immediately started Americanizing himself. Tomasz Kowalski became Thomas Kowalski, and within a year, he changed it again to Thomas Whitfield, because he wanted to sound more American, more assimilated, more like he belonged. He buried his Polish identity deep, rarely spoke Polish, avoided other Polish immigrants who might ask too many questions about his past. He worked construction jobs, saved money, went to night school to learn English properly, to lose his accent, to become as American as possible. In 1952, at age 23, he met Dorothy Mitchell at a church social in Brooklyn. She was a sweet Irish-American girl from a large, warm family, the kind of family that gathered for Sunday dinners and celebrated holidays together with nose and laughter and affection. Thomas fell in love with her partly because she represented everything he'd lost, that sense of belonging, of family, of home. When he asked her to marry him 6 months later, she said yes without hesitation. Her family welcomed him warmly, asking only basic questions about his background that he could answer with the story he'd rehearsed 1,000 times. He was Thomas Whitfield, came from Poland, lost his family in the war, came to America to start over. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. The real truth that he'd survived by taking a false identity, that he'd spent 3 formative years living as someone else, that he didn't even legally exist under his birth name, that felt too complicated, too dangerous, too likely to raise questions he couldn't easily answer. They married in 1953, and Thomas made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He would never tell anyone, not even Dorothy, the full truth about who he really was. He would be Thomas Whitfield, American, former Polish refugee, simple story, clean history. No mention of false papers, no mention of pretending to be someone else's nephew, no mention of the years of deception that had saved his life. He told himself it was for the best, that it would only confuse things, that his past didn't matter anymore because he was building a new future. Dorothy and Thomas had 3 children, Robert born in 1954, Michael in 1956, and Elizabeth in 1959. Thomas was a devoted father, present and loving, working hard to provide for his family. He eventually started his own small construction company, building a modest but comfortable life. He taught his children to work hard, to appreciate what they had, to be grateful for opportunities. He told them stories about Poland, about the war, about immigrating to America, but the stories were always vague, always simplified, always missing crucial details. He showed them Poland on a map, taught them a few Polish words, made his mother's pierogi recipe on special occasions. But he never told them his real name, never told them about Christina and the false identity, never explained why there were no surviving relatives, no extended family, no connection to their Polish heritage beyond surface-level traditions. As the years passed, as his children grew up and had children of their own, Thomas built a wall between his past and his present. The wall was so high, so carefully constructed, that even he sometimes forgot what was real and what was the story he'd been telling for so long. He was Thomas Whitfield, that's who he was, that's who he'd been for over 40 years. Tomasz Wisniewski was a ghost, a boy who had died in Warsaw along with his family, not relevant to the life he'd built in America. Dorothy died in 2010 after 57 years of marriage. She went to her grave knowing her husband as Thomas Whitfield, never knowing that even his name had been a kind of fiction, never knowing the full extent of what he'd survived and sacrificed. After she died, Thomas' children worried about him living alone at his age, so he moved into an assisted living facility where he could have support but maintain independence. He was a popular resident, friendly and charming, always ready with stories about the old days, about immigrating to America, about building his construction business. Everyone knew him as Thomas Whitfield, the friendly Polish American widower in apartment 3B. But at night, when he was alone, Thomas would take out the small gold cross his mother had given him 79 years ago, and he would remember who he really was. He would whisper his real name, Tomasz Wisniewski, son of teachers, trying to keep the memory alive even as it faded. He thought about his mother and sisters constantly, wondered what their last days had been like, carried guilt that he'd survived while they hadn't. He'd never tried to find records of what happened to them, partly because he was afraid of what he'd learn, partly because acknowledging they were gone felt like betraying the hope that somehow, and possibly, they'd survive. And he'd never told his children the truth because he didn't want to burden them with the complicated reality of his survival. Didn't want them to question their own identity. Didn't want them to feel the weight of the false name they'd been carrying their entire lives without knowing it. At 95, Thomas knew he was running out of time. He'd had 2 minor strokes in the past year, and his doctor had been frank with him about his prognosis. He maybe had months, not years, and he was carrying this secret that was eating him alive, this fundamental dishonesty about who he really was, who his children really were, what their real heritage and history actually looked like. His granddaughter Sarah, Elizabeth's daughter, suggested applying to be on Family Feud as a fun family activity. Thomas agreed mostly because he didn't have energy to argue, and his children were excited about it. They saw it as possibly one of the last chances to do something special all together while he was still relatively sharp. What they didn't know was that Thomas had decided this would be when he finally told the truth. He was 95 years old, he'd been lying for 79 years, and he couldn't die without his children knowing who they really were. The day of the taping, Thomas was quiet, unusually subdued. His children attributed it to nerves or fatigue from the trip. They had no idea he was preparing himself to dismantle the entire story of their family's history, to reveal that everything they thought they knew about their father, about themselves, was built on a foundation of necessary deception. Steve Harvey greeted the Whitfield family with his typical warmth, working his way down the line of contestants, making jokes and building energy. When he got to Thomas, sitting in a chair they'd brought out for him, Steve's face lit up with respect. 95 years old, Mr. Whitfield, you are sharp as a tack. What's the secret to a long life, sir? Thomas looked at Steve with eyes that held nearly a century of living, of loss of secrets. The secret to a long life, he said slowly, his voice still carrying the faintest trace of an accent most people couldn't place, is sometimes keeping secrets, and sometimes, finally telling the truth. Steve smiled, thinking this was going to be a sweet, philosophical conversation. That's deep, Mr. Whitfield. That's really deep. So which one are you doing today, keeping secrets or telling truth? Thomas looked at his 3 children standing beside him, at his grandchildren arranged around them, and he made a decision that he'd been both dreading and craving for decades. I'm telling the truth, he said. I'm telling the truth I should have told 70 years ago. The smile on Steve's face shifted slightly, something in Thomas' tone alerting him that this wasn't going to be a light moment. All right, sir, if you've got truth to tell, we're here to listen. Thomas took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was stronger than it had been in years. My children think my name is Thomas Whitfield. They think I was born in Poland, came to America after the war, married their mother, built a normal life. But that's not the whole truth. That's not even half the truth. Robert, his oldest son, stepped forward looking concerned. Dad, what are you talking about? Thomas didn't look at his children yet. He kept his eyes on Steve, using him as an anchor. My real name is Tomasz Wisniewski. I was born in Warsaw in 1929. In 1942, when I was 13 years old and the Nazis occupied Poland, my mother gave me to a resistance worker who got me false papers and a false identity to save my life. I lived for 3 years as someone else's nephew, with a different name, a different history. My mother and my 2 sisters were sent to Treblinka in 1943. They were murdered there. I survived because I was pretending to be someone I wasn't. The studio went completely silent. Steve Harvey's mouth fell open slightly, his eyes widening as he processed what he was hearing. Thomas' children stood frozen, not yet understanding the full implications. Thomas continued, his voice shaking now but determined. After the war, when I tried to reclaim my real name, there were no records left. Everyone who knew my family was dead. The only identity I could prove was the false one I'd been given. So I kept it. I came to America as Tomasz Kowalski, and changed it to Thomas Whitfield to sound more American. I built my entire life on a name that wasn't mine, an identity that was created to save me during the war. And I never told anyone, not your mother, not you, not anyone, because I thought it was easier, safer. Better to just be Thomas Whitfield and let Tomasz Wisniewski stay dead. Elizabeth, his daughter, found her voice. Dad, are you saying our last name isn't really Whitfield? That you changed it? Thomas finally turned to look at his children, tears streaming down his weathered face. I'm saying that I'm not who you think I am. I'm not even legally who I say I am. Tomasz Wisniewski doesn't exist in any official records. He died when his family died. Thomas Whitfield is the person I became, but he was built on a lie, on false papers, on identity created to fool the Nazis. And you three, you're the children and grandchildren of Tomasz Wisniewski, but you've lived your entire lives as Whitfields, never knowing your real heritage, your real name, your real family history. Steve Harvey had tears running down his face now, and he seemed unable to speak. He just stood there, one hand covering his mouth, staring at Thomas as the weight of this revelation settled over everyone. Michael, the middle son, spoke up, his voice breaking. Why didn't you ever tell us? Why did you keep this secret for 70 years? Thomas's voice was raw with emotion. Because I was ashamed. Because I felt like I'd betrayed my family by surviving. Because the false identity saved my life, but it also felt like erasing them, like pretending they never existed. Because I didn't know how to explain that your father was a fake, that your entire family history was built on lies, that even our last name wasn't real. Because I thought it would be easier for you to just be Americans with a simple story, rather than carrying the complicated truth of what it took for me to survive. He paused, gathering strength. But mostly because I was a coward. I should have told you decades ago. I should have told your mother. I should have honored my real family by keeping their name alive through you. But I chose comfort and simplicity over truth, and I've regretted it every single day for 70 years. Steve Harvey finally found his voice, and it was thick with emotion. Mr. Wisniewski, he said, deliberately using the real name. Mr. Wisniewski, do you understand what you just did? Thomas looked at him with exhausted relief. I told my children the truth. Finally. Steve shook his head in amazement. You did more than that, sir. You just gave them their real heritage back. You just gave them their real family name back. You just connected them to their real history, their real grandmother, their real aunts who died in the Holocaust. You gave them something precious, even if it's painful. He turned to address Thomas' children directly. Your father just told you that you're not who you thought you were. That has to be shocking, confusing, maybe even upsetting. But do you understand what a gift he just gave you? He gave you the truth. He gave you your real name. He gave you connection to family members you never knew existed. He gave you a piece of history, a piece of Holocaust survival, a piece of resistance and courage that you can now carry forward. Robert was crying now, as were his siblings. Dad, what was our grandmother's name? What were our aunts' names? Thomas's voice broke. Your grandmother was Marta Wisniewski. She was kind and brave, and she sacrificed everything to save me. Your aunts were Zofia and Katarzyna. Zofia was 8 when I last saw her. Katarzyna was 6. They loved singing. They would harmonize together while our mother sewed. I can still hear their voices sometimes. Elizabeth stepped forward and took her father's hand. Tell us everything. Tell us about them. Tell us about your real life before the war. Tell us about who we really are. And so Thomas did. For the next hour, while the cameras kept rolling, and the audience sat in silent reverence, 95-year-old Tomasz Wisniewski told his children everything he'd kept hidden for 7 decades. He told them about his father, the teacher, who loved books and believed education could change the world. He told them about his mother's pierogies, which he'd been making all these years exactly the way she'd taught him, one real thing preserved from his real life. He told them about the apartment in Warsaw, with the creaky floors, and the window that looked out onto a courtyard where children played. He told them about his sisters, about Zofia's laugh and Katarzyna's habit of hiding behind their mother's skirts when strangers visited. He told them about the day the Nazis came to take his father, about his mother's screams, about hiding in a closet with his sisters and trying to keep them quiet. He told them about the years of occupation, about watching his neighborhood slowly emptied of people, about the constant fear, about the hunger that made your stomach hurt and your head spin. He told them about the night his mother gave him to Christina, about how she'd held him one last time, and told him to never forget who he was. About how she'd pressed the gold cross into his hand. About how she'd been so brave even though he could see the terror in her eyes. He pulled the cross out from under his shirt, where he'd worn it every single day for 79 years. "This is the only real thing I have from her," he said. "The only proof that Marta Wisniewski existed, that she loved me, that our family was real." His children gathered around him, touching the cross with reverent fingers, connecting physically to the grandmother they'd never known, to a history that had been hidden from them. Thomas told them about living with Christina, about learning to be Tomasz Kowalski, about the terror of discovery, about witnessing the Warsaw Uprising and seeing his city destroyed. He told them about going back after the war to find his family and finding nothing, about the neighbors who told him they'd been taken to Treblinka, about realizing he was utterly alone in the world. He told them about the decision to keep the false name, about coming to America, about meeting their mother, about building a new life on a foundation of half-truths and omissions. "I convinced myself I was protecting you," he said. "I convinced myself it was better if you didn't know. But the truth is I was protecting myself. I was protecting myself from having to face what I'd survive, from having to acknowledge the family I'd lost, from having to explain how I'd live when they'd die." Steve Harvey, who had been standing quietly listening to all of this, spoke up. "Mr. Wisniewski, can I ask you something? When you survived by taking that false identity, do you think your mother would have been angry about that? Do you think she would have wanted you to suffer with guilt for the next 70 years? Thomas considered this, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression. "No, she wanted me to survive. That's why she sent me away. She wanted me to live." Steve nodded. "Exactly. She wanted you to live. And you did. You built a whole life, you raised 3 children, you created a family. The fact that you did it under a different name doesn't erase the fact that you lived the life she saved. It doesn't dishonor her memory. If anything, every day you lived, every moment of happiness you had, every success your children achieved that honored her sacrifice." He turned to the audience. "This man has been carrying guilt for 70 years for the crime of surviving, for living when his family died, for taking a false name that saved his life. But there's no crime in survival. There's no shame in doing what you had to do to stay alive in the most evil time in human history. And there's no betrayal in building a new life after you lost everything." He looked back at Thomas. "Your mother gave you that cross and told you to never forget who you were. You didn't forget, sir. You wore that cross every day for 79 years. You made her pierogies. You thought about her and your sisters constantly. You didn't forget. You just also survive, which is exactly what she wanted." Robert spoke up, his voice firm despite his tears. "Dad, I don't care what our last name is legally. I don't care about the paperwork. As far as I'm concerned, I'm Robert Wisniewski, son of Tomasz Wisniewski, grandson of Marta Wisniewski. That's who I really am." Michael and Elizabeth both nodded in agreement. "We all are," Elizabeth said. "We're Wisniewskis. That's our real name, our real heritage. And we're going to make sure everyone knows it. We're going to make sure our children know it. We're going to make sure the names Marta and Zofia and Katarzyna are remembered and honored." Sarah, Thomas' granddaughter, pulled out her phone. "Grandpa, I'm going to research our family. I'm going to find records. I'm going to document everything you remember. I'm going to make sure our real family history is preserved. Your mother and sisters won't be forgotten. We won't let them be forgotten." Thomas was sobbing now, deep wrenching sobs that shook his entire frail body. "I should have done this years ago. I should have told you, when you were children. I should have given you your real name from the beginning." Steve Harvey knelt down beside Thomas' chair. "But you're telling them now. That's what matters. You're 95 years old, and you finally found the courage to tell the truth. That takes incredible strength. Most people take their secrets to the grave. You decided your children deserve to know who they really are. That's brave, sir. That's really brave." The episode that aired 6 weeks later became historic. It was viewed over 100 million times in the first month. The story of Tomasz Wisniewski and his 70-year secret sparked an enormous response. Holocaust museums reached out to interview him, to record his testimony, to preserve his story. Genealogy experts offered to help his family research their Polish roots, to find whatever records might exist of the Wisniewski family. Other Holocaust survivors and children of survivors came forward with their own stories of changed names, hidden identities, families lost and never fully acknowledged. The response showed how many families were still carrying secrets from that era, still dealing with the aftermath of survival and the complicated guilt that came with it. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 3 months after the episode aired, Thomas received a letter from a woman in Warsaw named Ua Kowalska. She was the granddaughter of Christina, the woman who had saved Thomas' life by giving him false papers and hiding him during the war. WWII wrote that her grandmother had died in 1998, but before she died, she'd told her family about the children she'd helped save during the war. She'd mentioned a boy named Tomasz Wisniewski, who she'd hidden under the name Tomasz Kowalski. My grandmother spoke of you often, WWII wrote. She wondered what happened to you, whether you survived the rest of the war, whether you found your family afterward, whether you were able to build a good life. She hoped you had. She hoped that the risk she took, the false papers she created, the lies she told to keep you safe, that it had all been worth it. She died not knowing what became of you. But now I know. Now our family knows. You survive. You thrive. You built a family. You honored the life she saved by living it fully. And my grandmother would be so proud. WWII invited Thomas and his family to visit Poland, to see Warsaw, to visit the places where his real family had lived, to honor the memory of Marta, Zofia, and Katarzyna. At 95, Thomas wasn't sure he could make such a trip, but his children insisted. We're going to Poland, Robert said. All of us. We're going to see where our family came from. We're going to honor our grandmother and aunts. And we're going to meet the family of the woman who saved your life. This is important, Dad. This is our heritage. 5 months after the Family Feud episode aired, Tomasz Wisniewski traveled back to Poland for the first time in 76 years. His 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren went with him. They met WWII and her family, descendants of the woman who had saved Thomas' life. They visited the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, where they found some records of the Wisniewski family. They found a document listing Marta, Zofia, and Katarzyna among those transported to Treblinka in October 1943. They found his father's name on a list of teachers arrested and sent to camps in 1939. They stood at the memorial for the victims of Treblinka and said prayers for family members they'd never known but would never forget. Thomas placed a stone at the memorial for his mother and sisters, a Jewish tradition he barely remembered but felt compelled to honor. His children stood with him, all of them crying, all of them finally connected to their real history in a tangible way. They visited the neighborhood where Thomas had lived as a child. The buildings had been rebuilt after the war. Nothing looked the same, but standing on those streets, Thomas could remember. He pointed out where the apartment building had stood, where his father's school had been, where the courtyard was where he'd played as a child. His grandchildren recorded everything on their phones, documenting their grandfather's memories before they were lost forever. They visited the church where Marta Wisniewski had prayed every Sunday, and they lit candles for her and for the daughters she'd lost. The trip was emotionally overwhelming but also healing. For the first time in 76 years, Thomas didn't feel like an imposter. He didn't feel like he was living under a false name, hiding a false identity. He was Tomasz Wisniewski, son of Marta and grandson of Polish farmers, and his family knew it and claimed it and honored it. The secret that had weighed on him for 7 decades was finally lifted, replaced by something lighter, by truth, by connection, by belonging. Steve Harvey flew to New York to meet with Thomas and his family after they returned from Poland. They had dinner together, and Thomas thanked Steve for giving him the platform to finally tell the truth. I don't know if I would have ever found the courage without that moment on your show, Thomas said. Something about being there, being asked who I was, knowing I was running out of time, it gave me permission to finally stop lying. Steve shook his head. You gave yourself permission, Mr. Wisniewski. I just happened to be there when you decided to take it. But I'm honored I got to witness it. I'm honored I got to be part of your family finally learning the truth about who they are. During that dinner, Thomas' children presented Steve with a gift. It was a framed family tree, meticulously researched and documented by Sarah over the past months. It showed the Wisniewski family going back for generations, including Marta, her parents, Thomas' father and his lineage, all the way down to Thomas' great-great-grandchildren. At the top of the tree, they'd placed a photograph of Marta Wisniewski, one of only 2 surviving photos Thomas had hidden away for decades. Too painful to look at but too precious to destroy. This is who we really are, Elizabeth said, and we have you to thank for helping us discover it. Thomas Wisniewski lived for 8 more months, after revealing his secret on Family Feud. He died peacefully in his sleep at age 95, surrounded by his children, finally at peace with who he was. At his funeral, his family made sure everyone knew his real name. The program read Tomasz Wisniewski, 1929-2025, beloved father, grandfather, great-grandfather, survivor, truth-teller. They displayed the photograph of Marta Wisniewski alongside photos of Thomas at various stages of his life. They told the full story of his survival, of his mother's sacrifice, of his 70 years of carrying a false name to protect himself and thinking he was protecting his family. They honored Christina, the woman who had saved him, and they made a promise that the names Marta, Sophie, and Katarzyna Wisniewski would be remembered for generations to come. Robert spoke at the funeral about how his father's confession had changed everything for their family. We spent our whole lives as Whitfields, thinking we were just regular Americans with a simple immigrant story. But we're not. We're Wisniewski's descendants of polished teachers and seamstresses, connected to a history of resistance and survival and sacrifice. We're the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of a woman who loved her son so much she sent him away to save his life, knowing she would never see him again. That's who we are. And now we know it, and we'll make sure our children know it, and their children after them. Michael talked about the importance of truth, even painful truth, even truth that comes 70 years too late. My father lived with a secret that ate away at him for 7 decades. He thought he was protecting us by not telling us, but really he was protecting himself from having to face his survival guilt, his complicated feelings about the identity that saved him but erased his real family. When he finally told us the truth, yes, it was shocking. Yes, it changed how we understood our own identity, but it also freed him. And it gave us something precious. It gave us our real heritage, our real name, our real connection to history. Truth is always better than comfortable fiction, no matter how much time has passed. Elizabeth spoke about forgiveness and grace. My father apologized for keeping this secret for so long, but I told him there's nothing to forgive. He survived an unimaginable horror. He did what he had to do to stay alive and then to build a life. He carried guilt and shame that he never should have had to carry. And when he was 95 years old, he found the courage to tell the truth. That's all any of us can do, survive the best way we know how, and then when we're ready, tell the truth about what it took. If this story moved you, if it made you think about identity and truth and the secrets families carry across generations, please hit that like button and share this video with everyone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel because we need more stories like this, stories that show us the complicated reality of survival, stories that remind us that truth is always worth telling even when it's hard, stories that connect us to history and heritage in profound ways. Tomasz Wisniewski waited 70 years to tell his children who they really were, and when he finally found the courage to speak that truth, it changed everything. It freed him from 7 decades of guilt and secrecy. It gave his family their real heritage back. It honored the memory of Marta, Sophie, and Katarzyna Wisniewski, who died in the Holocaust but whose names will now live on through their descendants. And it reminded all of us that it's never too late to tell the truth, never too late to reclaim your real identity, never too late to honor the sacrifices that allowed you to survive. That's the legacy of Tomasz Wisniewski, a man who survived by becoming someone else but who finally, at 95 years old, had the courage to reclaim his real name and give it to his children. That's courage. That's truth, and that's what family is really about, not comfortable fiction, but the complicated, painful, beautiful truth of who we really are and where we really came from.